Welcome back to the Album in Our YouTube channel, the home of album reviews, discography guides and think pieces. Now today's video is a very exciting one indeed, because if you remember back, I did a video on the often failure of music revivals and how a lot of the reason why they fail is either because they don't do anything with the style that they're trying to bring back, or they're not faithful enough to it, various other things I brought up. But as an example of a kind of anomaly in that lane, which wasn't exactly a full-scale revival, was the revival of rave music, or at least the producing of old-school sounding rave music by a YouTube channel called Jack Acid, who I highly recommended in that video because I think what he does is fantastic, obviously, and you know, I've been a fan of his for at least a couple of years at this point because I really love what he does. And so I ended up reaching out to him about the possibility of an interview, because I thought, you know what, I might as well ask, and you know, it'd be cool to ask him some questions. If he doesn't say yes, then fine, you know, at least I got my voice out there. But he very kindly said yes to the offer, and so what I'm about to present to you now is the full interview that I had with Jack Acid. We discussed loads of things, really interesting things, like the club nights that he had when he was getting into the rave scene, what makes a rave track for him, the difficult kind of relationship that rave has had with the mainstream throughout its existence, various other really interesting things, and his insights are invaluable, and I believe in the description, but he also very kindly offered to leave a list of like different tracks and resources in the description as well. They might not be there, but he said he would give me his top 50 tracks, so if I've got them, they'll be in the description. He also gave a few other kind of more personal recommendations, whether it's music videos or various songs and things that aren't maybe in that list if it's not there already, various podcasts as well, compilations for you to check out and buy if you want. So he's been really gracious in really putting as much as he can into this, which I really appreciate him for. So yeah, please do go check him out, go show him lots of support. If ever he puts out anything that's buyable, buy it, please. Like, just support him, please, because I think he's fantastic. I think what he does is brilliant, and we'll just get on with the interview now, shall we? So, hello everybody, and welcome to a momentous occasion on the channel today, because I am here with my first, I think it's my first ever proper exclusive interview, maybe the second, because as some of you might remember, I did a video about genre revivals, and as a kind of footnote, I also mentioned that while not a full-fledged revival, one channel that I wanted to shout out was Jack Acid, because I thought the stuff that he was doing with like Rave and Breakbeat revival type stuff, well, not necessarily revivalism, but it was really good in that style, and we've got him here today. It's an absolute pleasure. Thank you very much for giving your time up.
No problem at all.
Tell the people about yourself just shortly.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much indeed for inviting me on. I'm flattered that you'd put out the invitation, and so I've snapped your hand up for this. I go by the name of Jack Acid. I've always wanted to produce my own kind of old school rave kind of music ever since I was in the scene. One thing that was slightly different about me, I suppose, when I went into the clubs and stuff, it was I never wanted to be a DJ. I wanted to be a producer straight away. It was something I just thought, I've got to learn how to make this music. By hook or by crook, it's taken a very long time, because back in the day, learning to make music like that, you needed a gigantic studio with loads of different, very expensive synthesizers and samplers and stuff. Everything was large and clunky and very expensive. And the computing power wasn't very good. And so I didn't have access to any of those things, apart from one friend who had a studio like that, but he very rarely let me in there and stuff. So it's taken a long time really for technology to kind of get to the point where it's small enough and compact enough to be able to start producing those sounds. So about 5 years ago, I started buying the equipment and just teaching myself, and just started putting my music on YouTube just because I love it. And it slowly just started sort of like going from there. And I'm addicted to it now. I can't stop.
I can't blame you. Well, I think your stuff is fantastic. We'll link your channel in the description, so anybody watching this who wants to check him out, highly recommend it. But the first question I wanted to ask you, kind of coming off what you've just said there, is that can you remember what your specific introduction into the kind of rave scene was? Because I know that people have these stories of like, oh, you know, I was sat on the sofa doing this and then this happened or whatever. Was there like a moment for you where, you know, maybe you were introduced to it? Or
there are a few I can think of, but the main one for me would have been when I was it was 1990, and I was still in school at that time. And I'd grown up listening to the kind of more poppy hip hop and hip house and acid house kind of stuff that was around in the charts at that time. Really into the things that called the KLF, you probably know of them, and Technotronic and things like that. And I was really into that kind of commercially kind of housey sound, and as well as there's some more underground. And then one day my friend came to me in class and he had his Walkman and he said, have a listen to this. And he stuck the headphones on over my ears. This was just before registration. And he played me a tune by 808 State called Cubic. And that blew my mind to smithereens, right? It wasn't even 9 o'clock in the morning. I just was like, and it's one of those tunes you'll have to seek out if you can't think of it what it is to hand right now. It was at the time the hardest record I'd ever heard in my life. It was a raw, stripped back, very angry, kind of like repetitive thumping synth stab with this kind of like Congo breakbeat at the background. It was nothing like 808 State had produced previously, because I was into their music and they were always quite melodic. But when I heard that, I remember sitting bolt upright and thinking, God damn, music's just changed in a direction that I really like. I want more of this. Of course, I wasn't to know, but I was just sitting at the right time in history, I suppose, to be ready to enter the cusp of like the golden age of rave music and stuff, which would have been obviously 1991, 1992. They were the two pinnacles. So that was the first one. I do have more, but I wouldn't want to bore you.
Oh, no. Well, obviously there's that moment where you kind of effectively fell in love with the rave scene. Are there any like particular memories of like the parties or those kind of things, or maybe like a specific occasion that sticks with you particularly, or anything like that?
Yes, there are. I grew up in a quite small town called Bangor in North Wales, and obviously that's quite a long way away from London and but I wouldn't say it's too far from Manchester and Liverpool, but it's far away from the cities to be considered a little bit backwater. But it had a really, really thriving raving scene, and that I think was due to be down to the fact that it was close to lots of really wild quarries. It was close to lots of really wild beaches and places like that. So there were lots of parties going on in that area. Now, the first event that I actually went to wasn't an illegal one. It was actually a proper night called Chaos that was held in this local nightclub in Bangor that I went to. And I was 16 years old, and I was terrified about getting in there, but my friend stuck a hat on me, maybe wear like 3 coats to sort of bulk me up a bit. We went into this thing, and it was 1991, early 1991. And I remember I used to go to that nightclub as a sort of teenager in the week. Sometimes once a week, they'd have this kind of like night, which was under 18s. And it was all kind of very poppy and all very sort of safe. And your parents could even sit by the bar to keep an eye on you and all this kind of stuff. It was like that. So when I walked into this event, it was a proper over 18s, and the nightclub was unrecognizable. It was full of UV posters everywhere, like backdrops of like mad sort of decals all glowing in the UV light. And it was the strobe light that I remember more than anything else, this thing that was like pulsing and pulsing and pulsing. And it made everybody's movements look really old fashioned and like they were in a film or slow motion. And so when I went in there and I saw for the first time, well, it was 2 things. It was the bass, the kick drums, the wallop, how the bricks seemed to be vibrating in the club. And at the same time, the way that was synchronized with the flashing of the strobes, and seeing people doing all these mad dancing and dances and stuff like that, it was nothing like anything I'd ever seen before. And the moment I went in there, I was like, this is me.
I mean, that sounds incredible. I mean, people talk about like the drugs obviously having a big impact, but I've always thought like if the music's good enough, you really don't need that. Like if everything around it is good enough, you really, really don't.
No, absolutely. I would agree with you with that. And I mean, that might be something you might want to talk about after as well. I didn't want to incriminate myself unnecessarily, but of course, that did play a large part of the scene. Of course, goes hand in hand. But when I was 16, I was pretty naive to all that. And to be honest with you, it was the music. It's always been about the music for me, first and foremost. So whenever I went to those things, sort of like experimenting with drugs was the last thing in my mind. I was going there for the music and just to feel that power, because the energy that music gives off in a club, there's nothing like it. I don't think there's been anything like it since either in all this time. Even though the music production standards ostensibly are getting better, I still don't think it matches the rawness and the power of the early rave scene.
There's certainly some great tunes to come out of that. I'm thinking of labels like you know, XL, Suburban Bass, those kind of labels. There's some
100%.
brilliant stuff on those. So I was going to say, you've already told me about your local scene in Bangor. It's quite strange to me how, you know, because England's quite a big place, and obviously you'd think the rave scene as being one very specific thing, but obviously there was loads of very, very different things. So up in Manchester, you had the kind of hacienda going on. Down where I'm from in Yorkshire, they had a sort of thing where, you know, people would like come from school essentially in their school uniform, go to a rave, and then be home for like 6 o'clock, you know. It's like these after school raves and stuff. Like just loads of really cool stuff going on. It must have been brilliant to be a part of.
It really was. I mean, and the things with all of these things, it's only when you look back, that's when you can appreciate that there was a scene as such to sort of reminisce about. At the time, when it's a very living thing, I suppose we're all guilty of just taking it for granted, right? But I feel lucky that I was blessed with a good memory. So I was always able to remember the key moments during the scene when it was developing, and the records that were coming out as well. Because the interesting thing about this whole thing was that the music, and of course we didn't know this at the time, but the music was in a hurry. It really was developing all the time. So you could say take music from 1988 and 1989, and you could tell the difference. Even 365 days, that's all it was that separated the 2 years, but you could tell the difference because the tempo was slightly different. Then again, the same between 89 and 90, and then the same again between 90 and 91, and so on and so forth. I feel very privileged to have been a part of it, and actually to sort of sit there as a dancer and a consumer and a spectator really of what was going on. And I was writing everything down as well. I've got here my diary from 1991, 92, 93, sort of compressed into things here. And I would write down notes when I cut back from the raves of the tunes that I'd heard, the dancers that I'd seen, and the experiences that I had. So it's razor sharp in my head. I only have to read these pages and it's like, I know what night it was again.
So you said that you started producing around 5 years ago, I think it was. Was there kind of obviously, I imagine for you being such a big fan of the music, as it probably would be for me, that, you know, starting to try produce your own stuff can be quite daunting. But, you know, was there ever a moment where you sort of, maybe it was one of your first tracks where you sort of thought, you know, hang on, I'm onto something here, you know, so to speak?
I don't know if I was ever confident enough to think that. I was just going, look, I was just having a blast. And I thought, you know what, I was basically making music that I wanted to listen to. So people weren't really making that much old school music about 5 or 6 years ago. But it, you know, we'll come back to that because it's come around full circle and it's really big again now, which is great. But when I started doing it, it was just as a hobby, just as a laugh, and just because I had some very basic machines, a drum machine and the TB303 machine, which is the same that make the box that makes the squelchy acid house sounds. That was the machine that obviously I grew up listening to in the 80s and the early 90s, loved it. And then when I could afford to get a clone of it 6 years ago, I did, and I was like, this is fantastic. So when I was doing the music, it was just jamming along and having a laugh. And you know, even if you go back to the very early videos, there's very few people have watched them, and the music is very, very raw, very stripped down, and I was just teaching myself as I was going along. But I quickly came to the realization as I was going that I wanted to fill the sound out with something else. And when I only had a drum machine and a TB303 synthesizer, it wasn't enough. It was very raw, very minimal, but I needed to have things where I could put samples in there and play keyboards and pianos and even breakbeats and stuff like that. So as I got better and more confident, I started looking at slightly more advanced groove boxes, as it were, that could do that. And that's where I'm with things now.
Yeah, I mean, it's strange because one of your earlier tracks, the first thing I think I heard from you was a track called Shimmer, which was quite early on, like a really long acid house jam. I thought that was fantastic. And then
Thank
you
you.
look at the difference between something like that and Cascades, which is probably my personal favorite of yours.
Okay,
I
thank you.
mean,
Yeah, yeah.
like they're both fantastic, obviously, but the difference is massive. Like, you go from very dark, dingy kind of acid house to like this really shiny Balearic type stuff. It's just
Right,
brilliant.
thank you.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
great.
thank you very much. Yeah. Well, that was the thing. I think really with all of these things, having absorbed all the different genres out of the house movement from 1986 to where we are now, and I've been a real hardcore clubber and raver for a good solid 10, 15 years of my life. None of those genres that I've listened to have been wasted. They're lodged inside me now. But it always harkens back. I love the tempo and the style and the energy and the madcap, anything goes attitude that the early dance music sounds had. And so that's why I've decided to stick in it. I have been accused, look, you're not bringing the scene forward because you're not playing kind of like, conventional sort of like current house music. Well, I'm like, well, other people can do that. They're much better than I am. I love it. I listen to all of that.
Yeah, yeah.
But my thing is, I know I'm very comfortable with rave and early acid house and all that kind of sound. It's ingrained in me. And if I've got the equipment, why not? Why can't I do it? It
Yeah.
gives me such a big smile, and it seems to have tapped in. I'm getting a lot of lovely feedback from people who seem to say, that we like what you're doing. And that's the
Yeah,
great
yeah.
privilege you can get, really, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, rightly so, I think. So now that you've kind of got a grasp on what you're doing, is there a particular method you have for like producing a track? Like, do you normally go beats first and then melodies, or do you have like a keyboard line or something that sticks out first?
It's chops and changes. That's a good question. I've asked myself that, and it really does depend. Because, well, here's the thing. As you may have noticed on my videos, I don't use computers. I use live instruments, as it were. So I'm using groove boxes, drum
Yeah.
machines, and actual tangible machines that I can operate by hand. I've never been able to understand how to operate or write music on a computer that goes from left to right. It doesn't make any sense to me. But having something with all the knobs and the dials and the keys in front of me, then I can generate something. Depending on the mood I'm in, I'll pick up the groove box, and I can talk about that later as well, because it really is an amazing piece of kit, the one I've decided to end up with. But
Yeah.
that's allowed me to do both. I can sometimes just program my own beat in and maybe have a 909 or an 808, or even upload like a breakbeat sample, have that ready. And then once that jam is going in my head, I can then turn on a keyboard sound or whatever, and I'm just sort of playing around with a little melody and something will come up. And often things just build and build and build. And I've got 285 tracks, and I think I've published maybe 30 of them on YouTube. And the reason I got that many is because I can sketch an idea down and then I'll stop, and I won't go back to it for weeks or months, and then I'll go, oh, and I'll pick it up again, and I'll just add, like earlier on today, I'm actually sketching out and rebuilding a track that is already on YouTube, and I'm actually going to make it better and add a bit more finesse and skill to it. And I'm just building it back up like that. So it's a bit of both, is the long-winded approach to answer to your question there.
I suppose it's good with live instruments to kind of, or live instruments, so to speak, to have that fluidity, sort of,
100%.
to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And the portability of it all now as well. I mean, the groove box that I use is called a Deluge, the synth strom Deluge. It's a little groove box that comes from two mad people from New Zealand. I think they're two geniuses that live in a shed, and they've knocked this thing together, and it's absolutely incredible. It's a synthesizer, it's a drum machine, it's a sampler, it's a looper, it's a sequencer. It's everything that I've ever wanted that I would need an entire studio for in the 90s, all in one box about that size. So it never leaves me. I take it to work. I'm busy making tracks when I'm on my dinner break and stuff with it. It's that easy to use.
I know this is a very broad question. I probably should have thought about it a bit more before writing it
That's
down.
quite right.
Is there anything that you look for in like what makes a rave track for you, is essentially the question. Like, is there a particular like set of characteristics that are maybe your favorites, or again, it's a very broad question, but
it is a broad question, but it's a good one. And again, it's a question that I'm actually going to try and answer on my own channel, because I'm also branching into talking about things as well as making the music. Now, dance music over the years, and especially rave when it first came out, was accused of being, among other things, formulaic. And it's true to a point. There are certain things that you can get inline that will make it sound like a record from a certain genre. There's no doubt about that. But I think that the same applies to any kind of genre of music as well.
Yeah.
What I'm looking for in a rave track, what is it? It's first of all, it's the danceability. Okay, it's one of those things. Does it just make you go, oh, that's okay, or does it make you get up and go, oh God, yeah, I'm going to lose my mind to this kind of thing. There is that element to it. I like intelligently written tunes with lots going on, lots of different layers. I'm a sucker for gorgeous chord progressions. So anything with like really atmospheric pads and stuff like that, I really, really love. And that's the kind of stuff I try to emulate in my music more lately. I've been trying to make it more melodic in that way.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Evan, the thing that I come back to, and I think this is the key for me, it's all about the breakbeat for me.
Yeah.
All about the breakbeat. And that's what separated rave music per se from house and acid house and stuff like that. From around 1988, sort of 89, the music was great, don't get me wrong, but then around 89, 1990, they started using the breakbeat in the kind of in dance music, and that really just worked its magic on me. There's one track in particular I'd ask you to go and seek out, and that's Back by Dope Demand by King B. Okay.
All right. Yeah.
When you listen to that track, okay, and you've got to listen to it loud in a club or on headphones,
yeah.
I defy you not to go, I've got to get up and dance to it, right? It's a track that could only be made with a breakbeat, right? It wouldn't work with a dum, 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 fall to the floor kind of kick drum. It needs a breakbeat in there. It's the groove, and I think breakbeat music is where it's at with that, and that's why I think I fell in love with rave music so much.
I mean, absolutely, because I think obviously like the sort of four on the floor beats have like are brilliant in usage in a lot of places. I mean,
of course,
I think for me it's probably the same for you as well. The breakbeat for me just kind of had that frenetic kind of constantly moving quality to it.
That's exactly it, and it's irresistible. And of course, what that breakbeat then that sound gave rise to was a different form of dancing. Which was the high energy, if you watch the clips of the early Prodigy dancers like Leroy and Keith when they're doing their thing, they're doing all this kind of like brilliantly syncopated footwork dancing, which I try to emulate. Actually, I've got a couple of videos on my channel.
I think I've seen it.
When I was decorating my house, and I just filmed myself doing it, and that's had 10,000 hits. But because I use the Prodigy music, I can't make any money out of it. So anyway, it's one of those things. But yeah, that kind of dancing style came out of it, like the Running Man and all that kind of stuff. And then the rave music sort of transformed it again, and now it's called like the Melbourne Shuffle or something like that. But a whole range of dancing styles came from the breakbeat, and it doesn't work with the fall to the floor kick drum. But there is another thing as well, if I may add as well. It's the sonics, the sound of certain hardcore records, like for instance the famous Hoover Stab. In Dominator. There was also another stab that came about on a record called Black Riot by Todd Terry, which was sampled and then used a lot in rave records. And it's a really, really, really eerie kind of organ sound. It was actually a violin sample, but it sounds like an organ. It's slightly discordant and slightly, again, I could think of so many records that have this, but if you were to play it in a loud club, it just gets and chills the bone marrow in your bones, and coupled with bass and breakbeats, there's nothing like it. Well, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it now.
You brought up that obviously, rave music is coming back in your eyes, which I think is obviously a great thing because it's great music. But me personally, I'm surprised that it hasn't been more of a high profile thing like a rave comeback, because obviously if you look at the pop charts, there's been like a bit of a synth pop comeback recently or stuff like that. I'm surprised that, especially given the massive amounts of nostalgia, that there hasn't been a kind of full on rave comeback, so to speak.
It's interesting, isn't it? Don't forget this. Obviously, it's 2022. It's 30 years now since many seminal rave albums were released. It's 30 years that the Prodigy first released the Experience album.
Yes, of course.
In some ways, although it's nice now that BBC and Radio 6 are going to launch a show about it next week and talk about it, back in the day, the BBC didn't want to know anything about rave music.
Oh
They
yeah,
didn't
no,
like it, you know. And so when it was charting, it was only because some of the rave records were such good sellers. They inadvertently charted, like Charlie, for instance, was initially an underground hit by the Prodigy, but because word got around, and it did so well, it charted. But the Prodigy never went on top of the pops. They never wanted to do that. Same with SL2. DJs Take Control on XL Records. That's an amazing EP. It did incredibly well, and on the back of that, then SL2 became a kind of like poppy rave crossover act, even though they were definitely underground. But they did that amazing Away My Brain and On a Ragga Tip in the summer of 1992. That was gigantic, that track. But the ravers, I remember all of us, we all had this kind of like unilateral agreement that we didn't like anyone going on top of the pops, and we didn't want to listen to the commercial stuff. So it was all about the underground. So as far as I'm concerned, I don't think it's a bad thing that it's not being commercialized again, because those in the know, and there are enough people out there that know it's doing well. And there are enough promoters promoting festivals out there now who are wise enough to go, do you know what, we need an old school tent. It's there. It's still there, and I don't think it's going to go away.
On the back of that, actually, as well, this is my final question for you. I wondered if, I know this is so difficult because you've got so many favorites, and obviously you mentioned one recently on your channel, Mr. Sandman Psychosis, which I went and looked at the back of that video, and it was fantastic. I loved it. Yeah, it was great.
Tune of all time.
But I wondered if you had like any suggestions of like where to look for beginners or newcomers, or maybe like a kind of starter pack, so to speak, kind of any specific ones.
Yes, I do. I do actually. Now, obviously, YouTube is a great place to find tunes, but if you don't know the titles of them, then where are you going to go, right? I actually do have, and I could probably take them out of my record pile, which is standing over there, but there are 2 compilation albums that I recommend very, very highly that would basically teach people who are just coming into the rave scene about the classic music that went before. And so I'd start with those. So the first ones would be the XL Records that you know of. You know about that label.
Yeah.
Their first 3 compilation albums, chapters 1, 2, and 3, are absolutely superb. They came out in 1990, 91, and 92, respectively. They're still very widely available on CD, tape, and vinyl if you wanted to get them. And if you type them into YouTube, you'll find them there as well. As far as resources go, the problem with it is that a lot of the original artists want their money, which is fair enough, and they don't want their tracks posting on anywhere. So they, so you have to kind of rebuy the records now, which I kind of think is okay. But there are loads and loads and loads of people on YouTube who play and record hardcore sets and then upload them, and they're for free, and you can get a really, really, really wide encompassing kind of like back catalogue to listen to there. But if you're looking for the newer stuff, then I would recommend Night Force Records, because that's the longest running rave label of all time, and they are now repressing loads and loads of like current stuff, and it's all modern rave music, but it sounds like it came from the 90s. And it, as an aside as well, I'm very happy to write afterwards for you a list of the top 50 tracks to go and check. I'll send it to you, and then you can add it on underneath your blurb, and you can put it on for your viewers. They can go and check the tracks that I'm talking about.
That sounds fantastic. Yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll do that for you happily.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you. Well,
anything to get the sound out. Anything to get the sound out.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I feel like it's maybe one of them things where, again, like you say, because it's not as commercialized, there's probably loads of people who are waiting for music like this to land on their doorstep. Because I know for me, it was a case of like me sort of searching for a while. I was like, what music do I want to exist? And it was, you find it eventually, and you go, yes, and I feel like, there's probably that for so many people with this kind of music, but just because it's not out there, they can't find it. So I think that will be
Evan, you're so right. I completely agree. Because if you, and I do spend a lot of time on YouTube looking at classic tracks just to see what people have been saying about them over the years. And you're getting so many people now going, I'm 20, and I wish this music was around when I was, you know, oh, I was born 30 years too late and all this kind of stuff. People saying, pardon me, that they wish they'd been part of the scene, which is great to hear, because it proves to me, and I know I sound like an old fart when I say it, but I've lost touch with modern music nowadays, especially charting stuff. I'm just like, you know, whenever people go, oh, EDM, the blood runs cold in my veins. I'm like, what the fuck? EDM, it's house music. All right, stop calling it EDM, for God's sake. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I hate all these like modern terms and the way everything's become about taking selfies of yourself, and you know, you're clubbing and you've got to look perfect and you're filming yourself when you're dancing. That's not what rave was about. You know, back in the day, it was about you looked a state because you had to wear clothes that allowed you to sweat, because all you went there to do was find your spot on the dance floor and dance. It was not about chatting girls up. It was not about fighting. It was about finding your spot to dance for hours and hours and hours. And I just wish that would come back. And I think rave music, because of its frantic pace and it's sort of like balls to the floor, it just grabs you around the neck and throttles you kind of attitude. I don't think it gives you a chance to go, hey girls, how you doing? You know, I think it's one of these things, you just got to find your spot and just carve your spot out on the dance floor, man.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is a bit of a warehouse vibe kind of coming back in a few places. I remember I've seen a few things around here where, you know, people are big onto like warehouse nights and stuff. So it is coming back in a way, and I think that's definitely a good thing, because it is becoming more about the music in a couple of places now, which is
exactly that. And big name DJs again. I think, I know it sounds like I'm moaning a little bit here, but I don't think you need them. You know, at the end of the day, if the music is amazing, you've got a good strobe light and you've got good people and like a warehouse, that's all you need. It's a very, very, very simple formula, because the music does all the speaking for you. It was a wonderful time, and it still is a wonderful time, and the raves are still out there. As I say, last weekend there was a gigantic rave called a Nightclub that happened in Scarlets in London. I was going to go to it, but I couldn't for one reason or another. And that was a gigantic revival. It did incredibly well. It was sold out, and that's in 2022. So that just goes to show.
You know, it's out there. You just got to look for it.
Exactly.
It has been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for giving me
your
time.
Likewise. Likewise.
Thank you. I'll link all your stuff in the description. Please go and check him out. I think the fact that you haven't had an album put out or something is an absolute travesty.
Thank you. So, I'm working on it.
Yes. Obviously, go onto his YouTube channel. You can hear loads of stuff. And if ever you do put an album out or anything, please go and support it, buy it, do all that. And yes, thank you very much for your time again.
No problem, Evan. And my absolute pleasure, my friend. Thank you very much.